how long was World War II? The answer, like so many others, depends more on perspective than one might initially expect. Perhaps you use Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939 as your start date, or perhaps you're answering from the perspective of the Soviet Union or the United States. It'd be different. But if you take the perspective of Japan, the end of the Second World War in September 1945 happened in its 8th year of continual major warfare. The bombing of Pearl Harbor and the official opening of the hostilities with the Allied powers came in the midst of a brutal conflict in mainland China, and by late 1945, Japan had spent more time at war than any other major power around the world. Over 2 million Japanese troops had died, plus 500,000 civilians. But even as an Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands appeared imminent, many officers and troops within Japan's military were deathly opposed to laying down their weapons. Some were motivated by fear of Allied reprisal, others by imperial nationalistic fervor. But whatever their reasons, even as Emperor Hirohito and senior military officials contemplated raising the white flag, a massive group of their subordinates would have none of it. Their last-ditch coup attempt would constitute a desperate final gasp of imperial ambition that even the emperor was ready to let go of. If it succeeded, Japan would fight to the last. If it failed, the coup's conspirators' last breath would be the last breath of the Japanese Empire itself. The people of Japan would never have known it, but imperial military leaders knew by June of 1942 that the outlook for victory was poor. The Imperial Navy had been devastated by the Battle of Midway, and the pit in the stomachs of Japan's generals and admirals only grew as the tide of the war shifted toward the Allies. Guadalcanal fell in 1942, the Solomon Islands 1943, Saipan and Guam in 1944. With the home islands within range of Allied bombers, they were devastated as firestorms lay waste to Japan's cities and civilians. Conventional Western military thought would hold that with such a bleak set of circumstances, Japan should have at least begun to consider a surrender. But that expectation ignores a whole lot of nuance around the Japanese military, both in terms of its strategic thinking and its guiding doctrine. At the highest levels of the imperial government, defeat and surrender were two very distinct concepts, only one of which was an acceptable course of action. Not only that, but Japan's policy of only educating its civilian population about military victories while admitting defeats had led imperial leaders to back themselves into a corner in which they either had to continue the war or risk the wrath of the public, both for keeping up a blatant lie for years and for losing on the battlefield. Unconditional surrender was unthinkable under imperial war doctrine, and despite a widespread awareness by this time that the war was already lost, there were no available options that would both end hostilities and gain approval from the military. In 1944 and much of 1945, imperial thinking shifted toward damage control and creating some sort of single decisive victory that would cause the Allies to consider less one-sided terms for an armistice. Barring that, the next best scenario would be to create the conditions for a brutal battle, a meat grinder that the Allies would so badly want to avoid that they might instead agree to a peaceful solution. After the fall of Okinawa in February 1945, a decisive victory appeared to be off the table, so the military shifted toward Plan B, creating a battle that the Allies could only win at extreme cost. By this time, both sides saw that battle coming, and both sides agreed that when it happened, it would take place on the Japanese home islands, with a first landing on the island of Kyushu. Japan readied an onslaught. Thousands of conventional aircraft, equal numbers of kamikaze planes, 1,300 kamikaze submarines, and even special operations soldiers who were expected to act as suicide bombers against individual landing craft. Civilians were trained to fight alongside the imperial troops, and the home islands were built into a fortress that would have to be captured town by town, street by street, brick by brick. This plan was approved by Emperor Hirohito, who was well aware of the popular unrest, the food shortages, and the crippled state of the imperial industrial complex. Like his commanders, the emperor was unwilling to consider giving up the fight in order to salvage the wreckage of Japan, with a general consensus that unless the empire stood its ground for one last decisive battle, there would be no empire left to rebuild. But this entire plan was contingent on one central expectation, that if the Allies wanted to take the home islands, they'd do it via conventional means. As we now know, in hindsight, that was not the case. But when the United States, the Republic of China, and the United Kingdom announced their terms for surrender via the Potsdam Conference in late July, Imperial Japan wasn't privy to that knowledge. In private, Emperor Hirohito found the Potsdam Conference's conditions for surrender to be acceptable, but his military and civilian leaders disagreed. The conference's warning of prompt and utter destruction, as far as they knew, was a reference to the invasion of the home islands. When Japan ignored that ultimatum, the Allies issued a clarification and made it exceptionally clear that they would not be invading the home islands directly. But, well, that clarification didn't come via written correspondence. It came from the Enola Gay, the American B-29 bomber that would drop a 13-kiloton nuclear warhead onto the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the bomber Boxcar would drop a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. Well over 100,000 Japanese citizens would die in the attacks, including tens of thousands of soldiers. And in the days between the two bombings, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. This radically changed the calculus of the Japanese leadership and did so on extremely short notice. Unconditional surrender was unthinkable, but the Allies had made clear that they could now destroy Japan without ever stepping foot on its soil. Caught between an unthinkable option to capitulate and an impossible mandate to resist, the Japanese Empire gave in to the unthinkable. Over several days of negotiations and with direct input from the Emperor, Japan's ministers made ready for peace on the Allies' terms. On August the 10th, 1945, Japan offered a surrender, with its single condition being that Emperor Hirohito remain the nominal head of state. The problem with all these high-level negotiations is that Japan's control over its own military had been inconsistent for decades prior to 1945, a problem that hadn't meaningfully improved over the course of the war. On August the 12th, news came that the Allies had accepted the Japanese terms of surrender, but had downgraded the Emperor's role to a purely ceremonial one. At the Imperial War Ministry, staff officers strongly resisted Minister Korochika Inami's explanation of what would happen next, with one major sticking point being that many officers believed that the Allied powers would sublimate the Japanese government and Emperor under Allied command. After all, that's what had happened in Nazi Germany just months prior, and forcing the Emperor into a ceremonial role indicated that they'd do the same here. As far as these officers were concerned, that was an outcome that could not be tolerated, both in the interest of the honor of Japan's military and imperial claim, and in the interest of their own continued survival. For these men, Japan's sovereign identity was beyond compromise, and if the Allied terms of surrender demanded that the identity be subsumed into a foreign system of power, then the Allies could drop all the nuclear bombs they wanted. So far as the officers were concerned, any Japanese troops left alive after such a bombardment would maintain their duty. They would fight to the last. So, on the night of the 12th, as Japan's senior-most leaders decided their nation's future, a core group of officers decided to take that future into their own hands. They would stage a coup d'etat, and they would do whatever was necessary to preserve their empire, or they would die trying. At the head of the coup was Kenji Hatanaka, a 33-year-old Japanese army major from Kyoto. Joining him was Lieutenant Colonel Mustaka Ida, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takita, Lieutenant Colonel Inaba Masao, and Colonel Okikatsu Arao, the chief of the War Affairs Division of the Military Affairs Bureau of the Army. Behind this inner circle was a collection of 862 other Japanese military officers of varying station with direct command over 18,000 loyal troops. On the night of the 12th, Hatanaka and his inner circle attempted to gain the support of Minister Inami, but they were rebuffed, and they resolved to finish their coup without Inami's backing. Over the following 2 days, both Hatanaka and Inami prepared for what they knew was coming, with Hatanaka shoring up support among the officer class and Inami agreeing to a pact with senior military leaders to carry out the Emperor's order of surrender, no matter what opposition they faced from within. At 9:30 p.m. on August the 14th, Hatanaka's forces moved on the imperial leadership. Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shizaki were able to gain the support of the colonel guarding the imperial palace and made overtures to the general in charge of the imperial army's eastern forces. Though the general declined to support the coup, Hatanaka proceeded forward. This had been an unexpected blow, as had the refusal of Minister Inami 2 days earlier, but without high-level support, the coup conspirators reasoned that their best chance was to inspire mass revolt among the Japanese military's officers. In a turn of events that Hatanaka may not have seen coming, Minister Inami killed himself on that same night as the coup plotters were still positioning themselves for a takeover. In the small hours of the morning on August the 15th, Hatanaka and Shizaki commanded their forces to surround the Imperial Palace and attempted to convince the general in command of the Imperial Guards Division, Lieutenant General Takashi Mori, to join their cause. They lied to Mori, claiming that the Imperial Palace had to be secured in case of a widespread revolt that might jeopardize the Emperor's safety, but Mori saw through the deceit and refused. Hatanaka responded with force. He shot Mori, as well as Mori's brother-in-law, who had been a witness to the meeting. With Mori dead, Hatanaka and his allies forged a letter in his name demanding that the Imperial Guards occupy the palace and lock down communications. No word would travel in, no word would travel out. At this same time, the Emperor and his close aides were in the process of recording the speech that would announce Japan's capitulation to its people. The copies of this recording, stored on 2 vinyl records, were now, for all intents and purposes, the most valuable things inside the palace, even more valuable than the Emperor himself. These records were the coup plotters' first priority, and once they'd sealed the Imperial Palace, closed its gates, and cut the phone lines, their success hinged on intercepting those records before they were presented to the public. The conspirators formed search parties and scoured the catacombs located beneath the Imperial Palace. Above grounds, the Emperor's staff was taken hostage and interrogated. Complicating the whole process, the city was on alert for further air raids, requiring a complete blackout and forcing the conspirators to do their work by flashlight. The rush nature of the coup made the situation even worse. Without any knowledgeable military leaders to help guide them, the conspirators had a difficult time navigating the catacombs and hadn't had time to adequately study their layout. Not only had the records of the Emperor's speech disappeared, but there was no reliable way to tell where they might be. Across Tokyo, other search parties spread out with several specific missions: kill the Prime Minister, find the vinyl recordings, and occupy Tokyo's radio stations in case the recordings showed up there. A band of rebels machine-gunned the Prime Minister's office and then attempted to corner him at home, setting both his office and residence on fire. Although the Prime Minister was able to escape his assassination attempt, the conspirators were out in the night in hot pursuit of the surrender speech and laying traps in the places that it might turn up. Except they didn't turn up. For hours, the conspirators searched the palace and the streets of Tokyo, but they had no luck. And like all coup attempts, the passage of time was exactly what their opponents needed to regroup, to understand the situation, and to take back control. Hatanaka's coup had been almost completely bloodless, with General Mori and his brother-in-law being the only casualties of the night, but that meant that the military's high commanders were still very much in play. None of them came to support the coup plotters, not a general, not an admiral, not a deputy minister. And if you recall that Hatanaka had asked for support from the general in charge of Japan's Eastern Army, well, that general in particular was pissed, and he had the entire Eastern Army under his command. His troops, better equipped and organized, surrounded the Imperial Palace as dawn broke, and Hatanaka and his inner circle were forced to face facts. The records of the Emperor's speech hadn't been found. The senior military had abandoned them, and the junior officers across Japan had little, if any, knowledge that a coup attempt had even taken place. Regardless of what Hatanaka and his rebels did to their hostages in the palace, Japan was going to surrender, and now Hatanaka would have to as well. He pleaded for a few minutes of airtime to address the Japanese people, to at least explain the intentions of his coup and give voice to those within Japan who sought not to capitulate. But he was denied. The general of the Eastern Army convinced the rest of the coup plotters to peacefully depart the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's vinyls were recovered from a chamber underneath the palace, and the business of the Empire resumed peacefully. For his part, Hatanaka was allowed to go on his way, with all sides aware of the implicit expectation of Imperial Japan's warrior culture, that he would be expected to take his own life. For the next several hours, Hatanaka and Jiro Shizaki wandered around Tokyo and distributed leaflets explaining their motives and actions. But by 11 that morning, both men killed themselves via gunshot, with Shizaki stabbing himself with a dagger in traditional custom. 1 hour later, at 12 o'clock noon on August the 15th, 1945, the Emperor's speech was relayed to the people of Japan. The Second World War had ended, and in all but name, the Japanese Empire had ended with it. After the surrender of Japan, the archipelago nation would be occupied by the Allied powers for the better part of a decade, with most of that time spent under General Douglas MacArthur. Unlike Nazi Germany, the Japanese government was not dissolved or made directly subordinate of Allied leadership, but it was encouraged to work in close coordination with the Allies in reconstruction. The United States had an overwhelming influence over that reconstruction, but it was Japanese bureaucracy, not American dictatorship, that ultimately rebuilt Japan. These years would be just as much a cultural change as a physical one for Japan, and demilitarization, democratization, and demobilized, peace-orientated economics took over the space that expansionist dogma had once held. With such a rapid shift away from the ideology that motivated Hatanaka and his co-conspirators, the Kyujo Incident quickly became a footnote in history, the last breath of a dying empire. But when exploring the reasons behind the failure of the coup, it's important to understand just how circumstantial its collapse was and how change at any number of small inflection points might have changed the overall result. Although Hatanaka and his co-conspirators didn't represent the desires of the entire Japanese public or military at that time, the last stand they advocated for wasn't an unpopular concept. Take as evidence the careful wording of Emperor Hirohito's capitulation statement, which never once used the word surrender, or the numerous stories of Japanese soldiers holding out for years or even decades across Asia and the Pacific after the war's end. Perhaps not the entire Japanese military would have followed Hatanaka, but hundreds of officers and tens of thousands of troops rallied behind him on 2 nights' notice. With a week to prepare? 2 weeks? A month? There's no telling how their decisions might have impacted the war's end. And although some sources dismiss Hatanaka's coup as the work of a naive group of reactionaries, it's a mistake to ignore the fact that all sides were on a very tight schedule to either support or oppose a surrender. The back-to-back blows of a second nuclear explosion and the Soviet entry into the war, the latter of which had been on Japan's mind even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, upset the thinking of a military that was previously still planning to hold out. With just 2 days to work, Hatanaka and his inner circle raised a remarkable level of resistance. As the night of the coup wore on, any number of things might have gone right for the conspirators. Minister Anami, who still personally favored a last stand when Hatanaka confronted him, might have decided to act on those feelings instead of backing up the emperor. The prime minister's bodyguards might have acted just minutes later than they actually did and have been unable to prevent the conspirators' assassination attempt. Hatanaka might have had access to a map of the imperial palace catacombs or convinced just one of the emperor's dozens of aides to reveal the location of the vinyl recordings. Or General Mori might have chosen to join Hatanaka at gunpoint rather than become one of the night's 2 casualties. So many Japanese leaders who chose to pursue peace had their lives threatened by Hatanaka, and if any one of them had chosen differently, or Hatanaka had had just a bit of luck on his side, the conspirators could well have progressed the coup to a much larger second stage. Japan might not have surrendered. Instead, the imperial military may have fought to the last. In reality, the days leading up to Japan's declaration of surrender were a race to the finish line, in which vastly divergent understandings of imperial Japanese values, tradition, and warrior culture would have to be settled once and for all on a timeline that nobody had previously expected. And in that final tug of war, Japan came inches from pursuing a fight to the last. If the Allies had indeed invaded the home islands, they planned to commit 42 aircraft carriers, close to 500 attack ships, and well over 1 million soldiers. Japan would have done everything in its power to ensure those soldiers' deaths, even as millions of their own soldiers and civilians perished both in battle and in yet more nuclear blasts. Had the Kyujo incident gone just a little bit differently, that could very well have been the history that we still carry with us today.